नेशनल इंस्टीट्यूट ऑफ प्रोफेशनल लर्निंग में आपका स्वागत है।
All right, I hope you're enjoying this look at special effects inside Photoshop. We've been spending our time working with filters and the filter gallery. I now want to introduce you to something inside Photoshop called layer styles, or sometimes they're called layer effects. Give me a second here. I'm going to go after another image here. I'm not going to bother saving this guy here. Inside the project files folder, I'm going to go after fishbowl.psd. Now, as the name would imply, layer effects or layer styles are going to be applied to individual layers rather than the entire image itself. Okay? So check this out. It's all going to happen inside the layers panel. There's my artwork layer selected. That is, of course, my underwater monster, my underwater sea creature here. What I'm going to do is I'm going to bring my cursor over towards the right-hand side of that layer and double-click. And that's going to bring us into the Layer Style dialog box. Okay? Now, let me give you a quick 5-cent tour of this dialog box before we start really going hog wild here. First of all, running down the left-hand side, we have all of the layer styles or layer effects that you and I can make use of. Things like drop shadows and color overlays and strokes and all the rest of it. Okay? And then once we select these guys, this center area of the dialog box is going to change to give us the controls for actually adjusting and manipulating the special effect that we're applying. And then, of course, way over on the right-hand side, we have the OK and the cancel. Okay? So let's zero in on sort of the center area and the left-hand column. Let's get started with something fairly straightforward. How about a drop shadow? So I'm going to go down to drop shadow here. I'll select this guy. Notice right away we get a drop shadow. And the drop shadow is only going to be applied to the pixels on, give me a second here, the layer that we have selected inside the layers panel. Okay, that's how layer styles work. Layer styles are awesome for things like text effects or creating web buttons or web interfaces, things like this. Okay, or throwing a drop shadow onto a cartoon underwater sea creature. Okay, so I've gone and selected drop shadow there. The center area here of the layer style dialog box has now changed. There's tons of options in here. Let me give you a quick run through. First of all, we have the blending mode. We know about blending modes from our layers panel. This is now the blending mode for the drop shadow itself. Okay, now usually I'll leave the default, or maybe I'll start monkeying around a little bit. The opacity or the transparency of the drop shadow. So I could fade back or drop back the drop shadow, make it look a little bit more subtle, or I could bring up the intensity, something like this. Okay, the lighting angle for the drop shadow. Okay. The distance of the drop shadow. Notice that these are all live effects, by the way, as well. The spread and also the size, something like this. You can really have a lot of fun with these guys. What's great about your layer styles, and I'll get to this in just a little bit, is they are non-destructive, which is really wonderful. So we can always come back and make some changes. So you're not really sort of locked into any of the changes that we're making here. Okay? So let's say I'm pretty pleased with something like this. What I could now do is I could go and throw on a second or even a third or fourth layer style onto my underwater sea creature. For instance, maybe I decide that I want to throw a stroke onto this guy. Do you know what a stroke is? That would be an outline. So I select stroke there. Now, with these layer styles, you have to be careful to check the effect and also select the effect for the center area to change. Let's say for whatever reason I want to go and throw some kind of a colored outline onto this guy, maybe a green or maybe a blue or maybe a yellow or an orange, who the heck knows, okay? Maybe something like this, or maybe a white. A white would certainly work as well to pull it off of that drop shadow a little bit. So you'll notice my white line there, which actually encompasses the entire object, but you'll notice them there specifically inside the shadow areas. I could increase the thickness of that outline just by cranking up the size slider. There's tons of other options in here. Position, so outside the object, inside the object, something like that, or the center of the object, so it's riding the edge there. And again, a blending mode. Just like your filters, I don't want to bore you to death with all these different settings that we have here. Really, I think the best thing for you to do is just experiment and play around and see what you come up with on your own, okay? But let's say I wind up with something like this. And then from here, I could keep the party going. I could go with a color overlay, maybe something like this. Color overlays are cool because they're applied to the entire layer itself, all the pixels on the layer. But maybe a red color overlay isn't really working for me, so maybe I decide to go into my blues, maybe something like this. But I want to fade it back a little bit so I still see my artwork underneath. So this is great for creating like a color cast or a color overlay, as the name would imply. And we could keep going here. I mean, you could get into gradient overlays, pattern overlays, inner glows and outer glows, and bevel and emboss and all the rest of it. I'm going to leave those guys up to you to experiment with. But more importantly, what happens here once I click on OK is the layers panel loads in all of the layer effects or layer styles that you and I have gone and applied. And I alluded to this earlier, they're non-destructive. So let's say I save my file in a layer-friendly file format like the native Photoshop file format, .psd, and then next week I open this guy up and I go, that color overlay, I'm not really feeling it. What would this image look like without the color overlay? Well, I can simply toggle off the individual layer effects or layer styles at will, something like this, okay? Or let's say, for example, I want to go and change one of them. Maybe I don't want a blue color overlay. Well, I'm going to double click on the color overlay, brings me back into the layer style dialog box, onto color overlay over on the left hand side, and then I can go to town and make some adjustments. Maybe, like I say, I want to change the color. Instead of blues, maybe I want an orange, something like this, or maybe into my reds. Who knows? Whatever change it is that you want to make. Maybe I want to crank up the intensity of the color overlay, or maybe I want to fade it back. Okay? Maybe I want to head to my drop shadow and make some changes here. Maybe I want to increase the distance of the drop shadow, or the size, or the spread, or the color of the drop shadow. Who the heck knows? They're non-destructive. That's sort of the point here. Let's say, for instance, I just thought of this, I'm making some changes here inside my layer style dialog box, and I go, that color overlay, I'm just not feeling it. Turn it off. Disable it. You don't have to use a layer effect or a layer style that you've gone and applied to your artwork. All right, there you go. There's your layer styles. Very cool stuff here inside Photoshop. Try working with your layer styles on some of your layers, including your text layers. That's where things really come to life inside Photoshop.